Welcome back to another set review. Two new sets that came out, Fenev and Petrine's Expeditions, and we're going to be reviewing Fenev, or however it's pronounced.
So the set review, we're doing it one at a time. I think there's generally less overlap between the sets, unlike there was with Quest of Roseblade and Seasons of War.
Yeah.
But starting with the Fenev, we have some angels with Celestial Principality.
So, I mean, it's kind of like a Mercantile Accords on a stick, right?
Yeah, it doesn't hit creatures, but I don't think you're really playing Mercantile Accords to hit creatures in the first place. And honestly, chances are, if you're playing a Mercantile Accords deck, there's a decent chance you're playing creatures. Like I'm thinking of the Mono White Soldiers decks that played it.
Yeah.
Where in those types of decks, naming like 2 was a really common thing that you wanted to do, but you had a whole bunch of creatures on 2. So this kind of gets around that. It does come with a body too, which is both a blessing and curse. Easier to kill, but a 4/3 is pretty nice.
Yeah. I mean, a 4/3 reach is a pretty unusual body in white.
And definitely against like Burn, as an example, where you want to be naming 1. The body is kind of nice, and it kind of almost offsets the fact that it's 4 mana. Where against Burn, if you play like Mercantile Accords on 3 and you don't have any blockers, then they just hit you with the Suitor of the Seas or whatnot. Whereas here at least blocks, so you can do something proactive on turn 3, turn 4, and shut them down.
Yeah, and the color requirement is a lot easier too.
Yeah, so if you're in just kind of more generic creature deck involving white, you can just play this in sideboard. Don't have to stretch your mana for it. There's also an angel for angel pools, so fetching off Disciple Ferida.
Yeah, you don't have to run Arbiter of Scales anymore if you don't want to run that card, because I mean, I guess Arbiter of Scales is still pretty decent, but definitely not the best card that you could be running, but you're only running it because you don't have any better options.
Yeah, and it's also Principality is also nice in a lot of matchups, where like Cane Dancer is another big one, or just kind of combo in general. Being able to main deck this card is a reasonably nice upside. We also have some other angels, which are mainly just for angel pools, with Seraph of the Sunset, which is big stat stick.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's a good thing to fetch off Ferida's Disciple.
And Fallen Celestial, which is kind of interesting. Big body gives your opponent a bit of Blossom, basically exactly.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, also not a bad thing to fetch off Disciple of Ferida. I'm assuming in Angel Pools, you're only going to run one fetch target, so you get to choose which fetch target to run.
I do think Fallen Celestial might even be playable outside of it being a big angel. Just because, how are you killing a 5-mana 6/6 flying lifelink?
The same way you kill every other 5-mana 6/6 flying tramplers, right?
Can you give me some examples?
Journey's End.
People are playing Journey's End now?
You know what? Good point.
Like, there's definitely ways that you can deal with it, but unlike Infectious Ego or Profane Emissary, where they only have 4 toughness, this dodges a lot of more stuff. Well, maybe not a lot more stuff.
Dodges Obscuriate.
But, yeah, dodging Obscuriate is big. Dodges dying in combat. Infectious Ego definitely dies in combat. A decent chunk. And, well, you're not killing this in combat. Kills in 3 turns from 20.
I mean, it also has lifelink, so you're getting tons of life while you're at it. Kind of a shame that this thing isn't a demon, though, because that would have been a good fetch target for Profane Emissary if so.
Yeah, it should have been an angel demon fairy, so it really can't block itself.
Unfortunate.
But big stat stick, definitely a worthy consideration, even if big stat sticks like Alan and Meva is another one are kind of hard to fit in deck at times.
The fact that it's fetchable is a point in its favor.
For decks that play Disciple Ferida, definitely.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have Mortified Medium, which is kind of funky.
I mean, it's a 3-mana Soul Sister.
Yeah, so 3-mana Soul Sister. There's also, in the same set, Become Immersed, which I figure is worth a mention here, which is a really good life gain spell. You also have Alleviate as another life gain spell that's cantrips. Gains 4 if you have more life than the opponent, draw a card. Become Immersed. Probably going to be draw a card game for a good amount of time. There's honestly a decent chance that you can have enough bulk life gain that you can actually get to high enough life totals.
Yeah, but like, you're doing all this work just to enable a 3-mana 6/6 flyer.
I mean, I like 3-mana 6/6 flyers.
Yeah, but is it that much better than what you could have been doing instead?
Well, you also get access to some other things, so like Mystery of the Dying Herds, likes you having 4 more life than your starting life total, which you definitely will do if you're trying to get to 30. Ali's Enforcer is a pretty similar card, turns into a 3-mana 4/5 flyer, only needs 25 life. And there's like some other stuff like Ayala who likes you having just more life than your starting life total. And if you do, then it's a 4-mana 5/5 lifelink indestructible with upside. Definitely a bit of a gimmick, but Mortified Medium is a Soul Sister. Triggers aren't self-entering as well. So if you want to play Sun's Sigil Dordana on turn 2, turn 3, Mortified Medium draws you a card.
Right.
Doesn't need a turn 1 Soul Sister. Maybe there's something worth doing here. Become Immersed is also probably good enough just by itself as a burn hate piece. If you're playing a ton of creatures, you play this, gains you probably 4 or 5 life for most of the game.
I mean, assuming you draw early, it's really bad when you're top decking. But I guess if you're top decking against burn, the game has probably already been decided by then.
Become Immersed does cantrip, so even if you're top decking, it's not that bad.
Yeah, like you cantripping maybe gain 1 life.
Or you can hold on to lands.
Oh boy, more reasons to hold on to lands. And how does it compare to other bulk life gain cards in the format, like Stand Unassailable and Byron's Gambit?
I think it compares really well, just because it draws a card. Also, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Stand Unassailable doesn't... Byron's Gambit too, though to a lesser extent. You can play them, gain much of life, but you just spent your turn 2 gaining 7 life, and there's no other things you did. So if your opponent's beating you down with creatures, doesn't really do too much. Whereas Become Immersed, well, only costs you 1 mana, so you can play another 1-drop, or do it on turn 1, so you save your 2-drop slot against tribal aggro. That makes it much more reasonable. So maybe on to have Clean Sweep, which is a kind of random card. I think just overall very efficient.
Well, I mean, it's a sorcery speed disperse with set mechanic, so we've seen these types of cards before.
Yeah, sorcery speed is definitely a bit annoying, but this kind of effect is generally pretty good, actually, which is kind of weird. It definitely doesn't show up as like 4 of anywhere, but just kind of having 2 of these to answer whatever the hell your opponent's doing. Sorcery speed is definitely a bit annoying, but at the same time, having a clean answer to whatever your opponent's doing is very nice, and you can do it twice. Agonize is a pretty powerful set mechanic. It does require you to play creatures, though that's generally not going to be too hard, especially if you're playing 2-mana blue spells, since, well, Cane Dancer is probably there for you.
Right, although this doesn't work very well with Cane Dancer. I mean, it does work well with Cane Dancer, but not in the way that you expect it to.
It's kind of awkward, because if you're Cane Dancing it, you don't get the Agonize, but then you can Agonize onto the Cane Dancer. Though it's not too bad, just for like a couple Cane Dancer targets that you don't really expect to Cane Dancer, but are there in case you need them.
I think this card's mostly competing against Crest, which has seen some play. And Crest is instant speed and investigates, so it's basically Crest draws you a card while Clean Sweeps draws itself.
So they probably end up going in slightly different decks. Crest being instant speed is probably a major deal. Wanting to be able to always get Agonize up might also put in different decks. Most of you can manage to use the Disperse on your own stuff. That's also potentially worthwhile. That's another way it works well with Cane Dancer. You can clean sweep a Cane Dancer to Cane Dancer, you're ready for anything again,
right,
or whatnot.
Although you have to do it at sorcery speed, so you can't really hold up stuff by doing that.
But definitely maybe a worthwhile consideration if you tap out Cane Dancer decks.
Almost sounds like an oxymoron.
Or just any kind of blue creature deck that needs some answers to whatever your opponent's doing. Maybe Hafik might be a deck that wants this, if Hafik is a deck. So moving on, we have Abyssal Familiar, which I'll only really mention because you can fetch with Profane Emissary.
And that's probably the cheapest Profane Emissary fetch target that you can find right now.
Yeah, I think definitely the best good one. Demons are definitely in high demand in this format.
Yeah.
Abyssal Familiar having Wither, making it put the counter on death, and even with hit face, does hit you, but that's the price you'll pay. Also, if you draw it naturally, it does activate your Profane Emissaries on turn 2, which is not too bad.
And I mean, Profane Emissary decks, they usually play a few extra fetch targets other than power pools. In the past, they've been playing Regent, Dark Hunter, fetch target.
Or Kali's Abomination is another popular one. But this is the first demon that's less than 4 mana. That is a decent fetch target. Definitely becomes more attractive if you have any kind of aristocratic things going on. But I think in general, it's just kind of, if you play Profane Emissary, maybe you want this card.
1 copy?
Yeah. 2 is definitely too much, it feels like.
It does do a decent job of gumming up the board slightly, so you can see it.
Does trade well versus some decks as well. Maybe kills a random mana dork. But moving forward, we have Nihilistic Treatment, which is kind of a funny card.
I mean, is it good? I don't think it's good.
I mean, it's fairly interesting. If you're hitting 2 cards with this, I think it's pretty exceptional. Since you're hitting 2 spells, right?
Right.
And it feels like if Mind Rot Red target player discards 2 non-land cards, it'd be pretty good.
So I guess the hard part with this card is making sure that you manage to hit 2.
That's the question. Can you actually hit 2 cards? Because it doesn't feel super unreasonable to hit 2 cards. but is it actually like consistent?
I mean, you're not playing this thing blind, right? You really want to pair with discard spells so you can see what you're going to name.
Yeah, unfortunately that's not too hard with like pay up. So maybe in a dream scenario, you turn 1 pay up, your opponent discards something you don't choose, a land or something, then turn 2 Nihilistic Treatment, and the opponent discards like 6 cards.
Maybe they're an aggro deck.
I mean, some decks can just turn to this off Mana Dork.
Is this what you want to be wrapping into with your Mana Dork?
Well, maybe not main deck, but sideboard maybe. We play against Burn, turn 1 and play Mana Dork, Log a Reckless or whatnot, turn 2 Nihilistic Treatment, name 1. Your opponent discards like 5 cards.
I guess.
King Dancer decks, your opponent discards like 4 cards. It's definitely more conditional than maybe you'd like it to be. Definitely for a main deck card, but I don't think it's crazy in the sideboard.
I can see it.
But
yeah.
Definitely wanted to get this out ASAP, so pretty specific in that regard. Another kind of a conditional card is Stiff Butler.
I mean, if you want to combo hate someone, there you go. If there's any combo deck that runs only 1 or 2 copies of their win condition, then this thing just completely screws them over.
I think that's most of what can be said about the card. It does also do pretty well against like any decks that start playing a lot of tutors and tutor targets.
Yeah.
So like we saw the God Watcher combo deck, and you can just exile both their Dark Behemoths or exile 2 God Watchers or whatnot.
Right. And like against Profane Emissary decks, if they only run like a single copy of Polyp Pools, then there you go.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Like, yeah, this does hit lands. Hell, there's a couple of decks with some really greedy mana bases that you can probably just shut them off at color.
Yeah, right. Or you can just like get rid of their utility lands that they're going to fetch.
Like turn 1, play Mirrorgate, name the non-basic. Turn 2, Stiff Butler, exile the basics of a color.
That sounds like it might actually work, surprisingly.
Yeah, you probably don't want to be relying on that for Stiff Butler to be good, but it probably works. Amelia is 2 mana 1/1, so not the best card in general, but
hey, I mean, it's not a creature ETB. You can like recur this thing.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe if you just care the mana cost and you're doing some other stuff with it, like what looks beyond, maybe it's worthwhile there, but pretty specific card in general.
Yeah.
A more general card, though, is Vile Edict. It's supposed to be the Edict, but it makes Vile.
I mean, how good is a Vile token anyways?
I feel like Viles are pretty good. I have to imagine they're probably slightly worse than a Clue, it feels like.
Yeah.
Definitely becomes a lot better if you have random things to sacrifice. Here, I think probably what's more interesting than the Vile itself is that it curves into Dawson very nicely.
Right.
So you go turn 2 Vile Edict, turn 3 Dawson, and if your opponent's just playing out cards 1 by 1, you've almost won the game. Dawson, of course, helixing whatever comes down on turn 2/3.
Yeah.
And that seems just worthwhile by itself. Dawson being a card that's very powerful, but it's pretty hard to get the artifact count for in these more standard Mardu midrange decks.
At this point, I think Mardu midrange decks do have a lot of options to just generate artifact tokens. Like they have Prying Inquiry, Pay Up, and Stocked Healer.
Well, Stocked Healer is definitely worse than Vile Edict. 1 mana 1/1 is not that great. And also you need to make white on turn 1 for Stocked Healer to be that great, which makes your mana base a bit worse. But there's definitely been quite a few decks that have like run Dawson, and Dawson's just kind of very mediocre because they don't actually have the artifacts. Like you mentioned, Pay Up and Prying Inquiry. Well, Pay Up isn't really a consistent way to get treasures, and Prying Inquiry is there, but also is very tempo negative, whereas Vile Edict is tempo neutral or positive, depending.
Yeah.
Vials also have some other neat uses. Spawn Cohort in these modding mid-range shells is relatively common, and you can sack that. If you want to sack your like Zareen, get it transformed, maybe that's worthwhile. Chigao is another thing that sacrificing creatures is pretty worthwhile for. Get another ETB. In general, Vials just seem to have a lot of uses in most decks, and the worst case scenario of just sacking like a land isn't the worst possible thing, or sacking another Vial if you have a decent number of them.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have Creative Salvage.
I mean, it's like Gift of the Phoenix, except you have to discard a non-land card. But it is an instant, which is interesting.
Yeah, so it does maybe not dodge Grave Hate, since all the Grave Hate in the format is instant speed, but maybe you can convince your opponent that you don't have anything worth hitting in the graveyard. Then end of turn, do this, untap, play your reanimation spell.
And I'm assuming that the main reason you're playing this card over Gift of the Phoenix is the instant speed.
I mean, Gift of the Phoenix does hurt you quite a bit. So, say something like Unearth, where you're kind of intending to discard creatures. Discarding a Bloodjade Prophet off Creative Salvage is quite a bit better than discarding off Gift of the Phoenix, just because you're basically going up a card, since Bloodjade Prophet does have that ratio of 2 life to a card.
Right. Yes, the difference is that Gifted Phoenix has a better worst case scenario where if you're stuck with lands, then at least you can discard them.
But then if you're stuck on 2 life, then, well, you can't cast Get the Phoenix. At least you don't want to.
So it's not flood prevention.
Additionally, decks that kind of aren't just intending to discard non-lands. So I mentioned Unearth, but also something like the original 8-sack build, which was playing discard to discard like Fate Stitcher, and it was kind of running a shaky land count.
Yeah.
So it probably wasn't going to flood. Probably likes playing Creative Salvage over Gift of the Phoenix.
That deck was playing Weed from Shaft and Distant Thunder at that point.
And you could also compare it to Distant Thunder, though that is kind of apples to oranges. Quite depends on the deck and your interaction suite, whether you prefer one or the other.
Yeah.
But overall, a card that's like feels relatively safe to say that it's probably going to see play somewhere. It's probably going to be good. Though maybe not discarding lands is a major downside, more than we expect. I don't know if this card is good or not, but I kind of like it. So Infernal Echo, it's kind of like a Splinter Twin that like doesn't need the creatures to tap.
So you mean it doesn't combo?
It doesn't combo, but it has a couple of neat use case scenarios because you can put on your opponent's guys too. And it's also a hasty clone as well, which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
It probably doesn't end up being good, but this is a card that feels like it's better than it looks, in the same way that Splinter Twin was occasionally just a good value piece. But maybe a better card is Wormwood's Bones.
Hey, it's Past in Flames.
Yeah, Past in Flames with Agonize. So it costs 1 less mana than Past in Flames. 2 off the flashback / Agonize. It does need to have a creature in play, though he did mention that all the cost reducers have more than 1 toughness.
Yeah, but at the same time, like this thing's gonna slowly kill your cost reducers.
You definitely would need to find a way to get more toughness on the board, whether that's just by playing more cost reducers or just playing something random.
Like Pupil of Lightning, because that thing gets a counter whenever you cast a spell from a graveyard, so you can just use that to negate the Agonize and keep agonizing onto that thing.
So I think one way to do it. If you want to be like very cheeky, you play like Dragon Wall Gates, which is a man land that doesn't cost mana and turns into a 0/4. Which, if you're like Mono Red Storm, I mean, your lands aren't super valuable, or your land's not producing red, rather, is probably fine.
Yes?
But I think otherwise, this is just kind of Past in Flames. I think you just use it where you use Past in Flames. It does require a bit more setup, but that's probably okay.
Yeah, there's little use in worrying.
This is fine, in other words.
Yeah.
So moving on, we have Authenticity.
It's starting a second villainy cycle, and it does completely different things than Brutality, so at least we know there's tons of design space left.
Yeah, but unfortunately it is mono green, which is not the best place for this effect, or for these kind of like slow value grinding effects. I mean, Brutality didn't see a ton of play, but it is a reasonable card. But green doesn't really have a ton of options to make use of this kind of card advantage. So like if this was in blue, for example, you could definitely make use of it with counter spells and whatnot, but there's not really a ton of ways to slow down your opponent in green, and it doesn't do that itself, unlike something like Villainy. You can definitely get a ton of value off it, particularly with additional land drops from stuff like Petal Weaver Lexa or Recall Forgotten Aeons. Does require you to like play land as a land drop, not just put it in play. So Logger Recluse doesn't work with this. So it does let you turn to Authenticity.
And also, it's just unreliable value because you're returning cards at random. I mean, are you really going to be playing cards that exile cards from your yard in order to get better hits with this thing? I guess you can, because a lot of the grave hate cards in green are just good on their own.
Yeah, you definitely need to find some way to make use of getting additional lands, because even without it getting them back from the graveyard, it does get it off the second ability. The second ability does only mill non-lands, though.
Yeah.
So decent chance that the first ability will have a decent chance of putting back non-lands. I think overall, I'm not entirely sure how you should be playing this card, because there's clearly cards that work with it, but I think that kind of deck doesn't end up working super well, just because you need to spend so many slots doing something that neither directly wins the game nor interacts with the opponent, which is always kind of pricey. There was another kind of interesting similar effect in Feynav with Somber Seer.
It's a combination, of course, of Crucifix and Crucible of Worlds, so quite interesting. Funny thing is, we got a similar card in a recent set, Field Tender, which also lets you play lands from graveyard. So, I mean, if you're building a deck around playing lands from graveyard, you got an extra copy of this effect.
Yeah, unfortunately, Somber Seer isn't as good at blocking as Crossroad Crucifix is. But playing lands off the top of your deck is pretty powerful, since you do become more likely to hit. spells off the top.
Yeah, and plus, this is a format with fetch lands, and you all know how Corsair interacts with fetch lands.
But there's definitely a lot of these kind of effects that work off lands and help you play additional lands. So Field Tender, Somber Seer, Authenticity. So if you want that kind of effect, it's definitely there for you.
Yeah.
But not sure what type of deck wants that effect, or how that ends up winning the game in this format. So moving on, we have Twisted Masterwork. You can probably talk on this card, right? You have
so
some experience.
The main thing with this card is that if you use it to fetch a Seeker of Untouched Beauty, it basically functions as a rampant growth. It's instant speed rampant growth even. So that's kind of similar to the interaction between Greensun's Zenith and Dryad Arbor in Canon Magic, where suddenly your tutoring spell becomes a ramp spell some of the time.
Yeah, Greensun's Zenith does only cost 1 to do that, but that's also a pretty messed up interaction in general. And Twisted Masterwork is instant speed.
You're basically playing a split card that's an on-rate ramp spell and a creature tutor.
And also with the Speak of Untouched Beauty interaction, it also puts 2 green cards in your graveyard for another Masterwork card, Dovin's Masterwork. So you can pretty easily fulfill the conditions for the reappropriate if you want to get a free drop in play for Warlocks Beyond or whatnot. In general, though, I think Twisted Masterwork is just pretty efficient for a tutor, particularly because of that Speak of Untouched Beauty interaction, where on turn 2, fetch you the land so you can play your Haldean Devastator on turn 3, or what have you. Or if you have 5 mana, you just fetch your Haldean Devastator.
Yeah.
I think Haldean Devastator is a good card.
And usually the -1/-counter won't matter because you're playing the creatures for their effects rather than their bodies.
It definitely does make fetching some things worse. Something if you really wanted to, you could play like Lone Survivor. Bit of anti-synergy since it is a non-creature, but Lone Survivor is pretty good. And Lone Survivor being 4/4 instead of 5/5 isn't the best, but small price to pay for a very good tutor.
This card's comparable to Beacon of the Wild, which is sorcery speed and doesn't put a counter on the thing, but if you want to make it instant, you have to pay 1 more.
I think in general it's just going to be mostly better than Beacon of the Wild.
Yeah, it's definitely just better.
So moving forward, we have Wall of Ivy. I think this card's probably my favorite card of the set. I like my 1 mana green commons.
It definitely looks very innocuous.
So base level, I think this card's just pretty reasonable. Kind of like a stocked healer in a lot of ways.
I mean, it literally is just stocked healer, but makes a different artifact token type and has different stats. It's a different color.
Oh, what differences?
Yeah.
Definitely like Log of Recluse has shown that a 0/3 blocks pretty darn well. And green is also just generally, I think, a better color for a stocked healer, since maybe the most important card in like Concord type decks is Tamiyo, Lunar Archivist. Since Tamiyo is just a very incredibly powerful card, you also have access to like Sights Beyond in green-blue Concord type spells. And just with those alone, you have curves like Wall of Ivy into Sights Beyond into Tamiyo. And then at that point, Tamiyo -2 is drawing 5, discarding 1. Since you have land, creature, artifact, enchantment, planeswalker. Also, the Vial tokens are pretty interesting because not only do they serve kind of like a clue if you don't have anything going on, but sacrificing also can be an upside. So you have something like Lion Ambush, which you want to sacrifice. So not only do you get a cheaper clue, but you also get the prey upon effect of Lion Ambush.
Actually, just Vials being mostly incidental sack outlets. Really good in decks that want that sort of effect.
Yeah, like we mentioned with Vial Edict, that Sworn Cohort is a nice sack outlet, or a nice thing to sack, rather.
Yeah.
And then you also have interactions like Posey, being able to turn Wall of Ivy or the Vial into a 3/3.
And being your opponent to death with a Vial. How vile.
Yeah, Vial seals. And then you just have the Wall of Ivy left to block. But there's just a lot of cards that work with Wall of Ivy. And I think for decks that just want Vials, if you're in green, Wall of Ivy is just pretty good. Vials aren't the most extensive mechanic in Feynav, so anything that does so efficiently is pretty nice.
Speaking of green creatures that make Vials, we have Renatured Vines, which draws a card and makes a Vial on ETB. So, like, you're already getting a card back from this guy.
So if we wanted to continue the Tamiyo curve, that after drawing 5, you play Renatured Vines, and it's a 8/8. I mean, 7/7 if you discard hand size, but...
Yeah, and then you just start beating your opponent with giant Renatured Vines.
Yeah, I think most decks probably don't want this card, but it's big, it draws a card, makes a Vial. It's probably the best 4-drop in green.
Which isn't actually saying much, seeing as we had to play Pine Blight Caribou with an 8-sack as my 4-drop option.
Yeah, and arguably Pine Blight Caribou is better because it gains life. Slightly different rules, but it's a pretty respectable card. Moving forward, we have Beatrice's Dodger. So 2 mana 1/1 makes another 1/1 on attack, which is pretty reasonable in some decks. They're hybrid, so it's easier to put in the deck. If you can make use of extra 1/1s or just kind of larger boards in general, it's pretty nice. And then the backside is also pretty powerful, since you not only get to see your opponent's hand, you get to take a card from it and cast it for free.
I mean, it is 5 mana to get back.
It is instant speed, so Beatrice will dodge sorcery speed removal, which is pretty nice. And I think the base form is reasonably efficient. Maybe requires a bit of a particular deck, though maybe it does just end up being blocked. But definitely just the fact that it's hybrid, so you can play in mono red or mono black makes it pretty nice. So you can curve this into like a Rapacious Rattler, or if you want to go mono tokens, but on something like Raga, because pretty naturally out of it. Admittedly, there's not a ton of go wide synergies in red at the moment, but this is pretty efficient if you do want to mess around with that. And Beatrice is definitely the type of card that would be able to steal games with just a single hit getting through. So then we have Bitter Starfall.
Like combo bait.
Yeah, definitely seems like combo bait. I don't actually know what to do with this card, but it's just pretty darn efficient.
If a deck exists that needs this effect, then they'll run it.
Yeah, unfortunately not in the best colors, but I think this effect is powerful enough that you probably don't mind that it's not in the best colors.
Yeah, I mean, you can always add more colors to your combo deck.
But just generally any kind of permanent-based combo, permanents that big mana are gonna like playing with this. So like we do have Dwindling Stores, something that might work well. Would need a way to discount Dwindling Stores, but I imagine that's not excessively hard to do.
Yeah.
But just generally an interesting enough fact that I figure worth pointing out. Then we have Edgar, Divine Regent, and well, consider that you get payout on turn 1, and then, oh no, you'll discard Edgar, Divine Regent, instead of what they name. Oh no.
They get treasure, though.
Oh no, they get a treasure. Then you attack for 4. Definitely accelerates the game a ton. But I think generally you're going to be pretty happy having a 4-2 down on turn 0.
Maybe it'll even disincentivize people from playing pay up on turn 1.
Depending on the deck, this also really disincentivizes Valdez, naming high, at least.
Yeah. But like, are you really going to be playing this card just because you want to wreck discard decks?
I mean, if you want to wreck discard decks, yes.
I guess you run it in the sideboard.
Yeah. There has been a fair amount of random discard things that have seen play. Stuff like the Mind Falters, Shift the Sands, or just stuff like Callier's Abomination or Yadimian Charm. There's a pretty decent list of cards that this really wrecks. Owl's Descent and Breach the Mind got played in deck that made it finals last GP.
Is the backside relevant at all?
I mean, it's a pretty scary backside. 6/6 hexproof indestructible, you don't lose the game for having 0 less life.
I guess 6 mana isn't too bad.
It definitely depends on the deck you're playing it in, whether this is going to flip reasonably or not. But it's not the craziest card to flip. 6 isn't too much. I mean, people have coalesced EHS in pretty reasonable decks.
Yeah, and then once you flip it, you start beating down with the 6/6 indestructible hexproof. Not actually a god, it's an angel avatar.
But I think mostly there's good amount of discard that just kind of naturally puts it in play. Deathbit Trophy is another one that's seen play with like Box and Dawson. Down with the Ship, Dusk Lieutenant. Admittedly, if it's not being discarded, it's not the best card. Though, as you mentioned, maybe you can just play it. The intention that it's going to be a threat if you flip it. 4-2 on turn 2 off a dork isn't the craziest thing. But I think mostly you're playing it because you want to laugh at people playing Pay Up and Velas and Deathbit Trophy and Breach the Mind and Bell's Descent and Deathbit Trophy and Kelly's Abomination and
Dawson.
And Dawson.
Oh yeah, you can tack into Dawson and discard that thing.
Oh man, that's even crazier. Perform of Ambition. They attack with Perform of Ambition. You discard Edgar, block Perform of Ambition.
Yeah. Well, anyways, that's enough fantasizing. Let's move on.
Recoil. Etc. etc. Shroud the World in Doom if you get lucky. But yeah, moving on, we have Ethereal Pact.
What a weird card. Actually, the entire Pact cycle is pretty weird.
Yeah, this one's definitely very interesting. So it's a 4-mana Time Twister, but stapled to a card that doesn't want you to play Time Twister. So maybe most naturally you'll try and play it with like Witch's Invocation to give it flash, and all the other cards flash. Maybe play it with Legend Weaving.
But then you're not making good use of the shuffle effect, right? Because you want to empty your hand.
Yeah, you definitely need to maybe go low on the curve. But even after this resolves, if you can manage to like put into play with like decent board parity, and if your deck's kind of built around this, then it feels like you're pretty good to win the game afterwards.
So like if you're playing a bunch of flash creatures, you play something on your turn, play something on your opponent's turn.
Yeah, that kind of idea.
And then meanwhile your opponent's getting screwed over by the effect.
Yeah, that would be the plan. Maybe a bit gimmicky, and maybe you even want to try and kill it yourself. I mean, there's a bunch of vials, right?
Yeah, maybe that's the intended play pattern.
So you can maybe try and storm off with this if you're feeling spicy. And immediately 4 mana, plus you need another conditional thing, is a bit hard. I mean, it is a 4 mana draw 7.
Yeah, I mean, Grasp for Understanding got banned. This is like a lot worse than Grasp for Understanding, but like still.
Yeah, and you do get to keep the cards in hand, unlike Grasp. And I mean, there are like good amount of ways to put this in play. I mean, Back in the Dan was something mentioned earlier, and that puts this in play really cheaply, or relatively cheaply, I guess, 3 mana.
Yeah.
There's also stuff like Seek the Maker's Egg, or like Chiara, which are nice with colors. But really just the entire pack cycle, part of what makes them interesting is them being enchantments. So I guess we can move on to like some other packs even. So we can move on to
Your pact?
Lunar Pact.
Yeah.
So this one's kind of different because more of the power is based off the restriction rather than the ETB.
It's a winter orb.
Yeah, pretty damn good winter orb, since it also restricts everything, not just lands.
You play this thing down and it basically just locks up the board for a while. I mean, it doesn't affect basic lands, so you can play in a deck that has lots of basics, and then you can just spend all your untaps on your creatures.
I mean, it kind of reads like you want to be playing this in Blue Moon, right? Or like the modern deck that was like basically mono blue playing Blood Moon.
Yeah.
Like this fits in pretty darn well there. Really, any deck that you're not playing many non-basic permanents, you're probably pretty happy about playing this. Admittedly, 4 mana, no ETB is a bit sketchy, but
it does have an ETB.
Well, okay, yes, it does have an ETB. Though notably, it's not up to. So if you're the only one with the creatures, you will have to target your own creatures.
Huh. I mean, you can just play with stuff that isn't tapped, so like planeswalkers.
I mean, maybe this is something that you play with like Zerat. Play this, Zerat, bunch of counter spells. Maybe that does stuff.
Yeah.
Works really well for like Cosmics and Core. Maybe people are pretty able to put basics in play, and mana bases are built around them. But it also just really locks in the board as well. Presumably they don't have like more than 3 basics in play, so you are going to restrict their mana a fair bit. And if they're untapping lands, they're not untapping creatures.
Yeah.
And if they're not untapping creatures, then you're not dying, which is probably good.
Yeah.
And they're not killing your Zerat and what have you. But this card's really interesting.
Okay, next pact, Bitter Pact. It's a Vindicate.
Vindicate.
Or at least non-basic Vindicate. Staple to Bonds of Vitality.
Yeah, so the Bonds of Vitality, or whatever this effect is, probably isn't too relevant. I mean, it does mess over, like, Kaelin, I guess.
Yeah.
There's probably some other random indestructible stuff that you are happy this messes over. But I think mostly this is just Vindicate stapled to a enchantment, which is pretty good utility. So, like, Seek the Maker's Egg or Chiara might like this card.
Yeah,
not the best cards for Chiara, unfortunately, but
Chiara can just cycle these packs, right?
Just like cycling Vindicates even, with just Bitter Pact. Kill your opponent's threats, kill your opponent's lands is pretty nasty. I don't think there's too much utility for Bitter Pact outside of enchantment synergies, but it's very efficient. Or, maybe not very efficient, but it is an enchantment with really good utility. Not too bad to hardcast this. I mean, it does kill everything.
No, it doesn't kill stuff with ward.
And you can pay the mana, I guess.
Yeah, but
wait, there's something in the set with ward. I don't think that's...
Yes, there's a Soul of Temptation with ward.
So I don't think the set came out before ward was introduced.
Maybe this card was designed before ward was introduced.
But mostly stops stuff.
Yeah.
But just pretty good utility. So moving back outside of pack stuff, we have Ethereal Scouring.
It's like a mix between Out-of-Body Experience and Journey's End. Or no, not Journey's End. It's like Unexpectedly Absent.
Journey's End seemed like pretty close.
Well, I mean, this thing's going to come back 3 turns down the road, so it's not as final of an answer as Journey's End.
But like 3 turns down the road is kind of like enough time that you probably will find an answer to it by then. A decent chance your opponent just shuffles. They need to fetch or something.
Right.
I think the important part about this card is that unlike Out-of-Body Experience and Journey's End, is that it's both castable mono blue and also cane danceable. So it gives a lot better answers for blue decks if you don't want to go into white, since white isn't the best color outside of these removal spells, at least not for the kind of flashy style decks. So maybe you can get away with the Ethereal Scouring. Good cane dancer target as well. So it means that you don't have to necessarily play all too many 2 blue drops aside that. Additionally, the blue 2 drops that we have access to now aren't the best removal, Or at least not as good as this is for removal.
Yeah, because you have Oppressed a week, basically, and I guess
Yeah.
Ignition Point.
Yeah, there's a couple. They do require you to be in specific colors.
So, I mean, do you just slap this thing into, like, your typical Chain Dancer bounty deck?
Oh, maybe. Doesn't seem bad.
Is it more of a
Definitely
tempo card, or is it more of a
probably
control card?
more a control card. I think it doesn't go into anything immediately now, unless if you maybe want to play it in like Tropic Thunder. No, I guess it doesn't work in Tropic Thunder because never triggers Augment
Right.
with Thunder Roads. But I mean, it's just kind of nice that you don't necessarily need to play the standard set of Cane Dancer targets. That's the main reason why I'm pointing it out. And like blue-white control, if that's a deck, maybe wants this. Decks that aren't really allowed to play Bounty of the Gardens, but doesn't necessarily want Portal Fracture, but does want Cane Dancer. Like decks with Kaelin in it, which like Cane Dancer because they can bounce it, but don't have the best targets. May like this.
Also, like, we're talking about this card like it's a hard removal spell, but does leave behind a 1/1 flyer. So we've already played as Albody, so we already know what that sort of downside is like.
Yeah, definitely not great, but does deal with Planeswalkers, which is pretty nice.
Right.
But I'm not sure if it's better or worse than Journey's End, because at the same time, giving your opponent Scry 1 isn't the best either, especially in the later stage of the game when lands are dead.
Yeah.
But I think it's a pretty interesting card. Moving on, we have Leticia Petrine. So, front side makes files, kind of is Grave Hate.
I mean, it's basically like Deathright Shaman, right? In how it exiles stuff.
Yeah, notably, MSCM doesn't have a ton of creatures or lands that you need to Grave Hate. There are definitely some. I mean, Unearth as a deck definitely likes its creatures and yards. But a lot of the more casual Grave Hate you want is for spells, for Cane Dancer, and Coalesce. That's definitely relevant in that respect. Then you can either make a bunch of vials, get value that way, or turn her into a very hard planeswalker to remove.
What? So it's 7 starting loyalty.
Kind of 8 if you count the -1/-1 counter. So, like, how are you removing Wormwood from play?
Good question. I guess you just use hard removal, because definitely not getting through with damage.
Immediately, you don't necessarily need to kill Wormwood immediately, because the +2 and -1 aren't the scariest things. But the -10 is pretty scary, and she gets it pretty fast.
I mean, you only have to uptick for 3 turns to get it, I think.
Immediately, that is in addition to the turns to get the vials. But if you are playing it with like Wall of Ivy and Vial Edict, you can just play as a 4-mana walker, virtually.
Or, just play it out on turn 2 and then flip it on turn 3.
Yeah, that works too. Though, in that case, you would need 2 Wall of Ivies. Actually, I guess you don't need 2 Wall of Ivies because the tap ability doesn't cost anything.
Oh, yeah, right.
The Wall of Ivy, Leticia, then turn 3, XL 2 lands, probably.
They have to be from the same graveyard?
Yeah, from a graveyard, so presumably. Okay. And then flip, and then you have a 7 loyalty walker.
Hey, that's like even higher loyalty than Oko.
And I mean, at that point, you can also like -1, sack your Wall of Ivy. Your opponent sacks their Profane Emissary, whatever.
Yeah,
whatever 2-drop they play.
The next turn they play a creature, you minus Wormwood again. And then how are they supposed to ever get through to her?
The -1 does affect you, so don't want to be -1ing too much.
You're drawing a card, how are you ever going to run out of value when you're -1ing?
And I guess if you're playing Wall of Ivy anyways, you're going to have stuff to sack there.
Yeah. This thing just completely grinds down your opponent's board over time. So
Amelia does have some stiff competition, since it is a green-black 2-drop. And of course, there's a lot of good green-black 2-drops. Anise 2, underneath a Muck Bruiser, Profane Emissary, Ruin Delver.
We haven't even mentioned Chile yet.
Oh yeah, Chile.
But I mean, if you're playing a deck that has ways to make lots of vials, turn 3, 7 loyalty planeswalker that affects the board seems really good.
And maybe you can even play in the Wall of Ivy, like, cameo deck, since that deck likes having vials. Planeswalkers are good for Concord.
Yeah, but how are you flipping Letty? Are you playing Sultai Concord at that point?
Yeah, not really a big deal. 3 colors is pretty easy to get.
Right, and I guess you can even just splash the black because you only need it to flip her. You don't actually need it to cast her.
Yeah, play black for a couple of removal spells, maybe. Play Prying Inquiry in the board as another good Concord thing. Get some interaction as well. Hits Wealth as well. But moving on, we have another flip card in Barton.
Barton, but not the Barton's Journal version.
Oh yeah, this is, I didn't even realize that. Same person.
No, it's not.
Same journal. It's not? Okay.
No, it's a different
well, you just
person.
checked me.
Yeah, I'm surprised there hasn't been more name collisions in the custom Magic community.
I mean, I guess people might be generally aware of other sets in MSC verse. So, Miss Margaret, Barton, the front side, kind of like a towel, almost.
Thalia?
I mean, well, in context of MCM, Thalia, otherwise.
Talia?
Yeah, Talia. Tau does fly 2 power, doesn't restrict everything your opponent has, also restricts your own stuff, which is occasionally annoying.
Yeah.
Is double hybrid, so unlike Thalia, so you can play this in mono blue if you want to.
I mean, isn't that the same for Tal?
Yeah, so Tal is definitely the more aggressive option. Barton does flip into a much better body at 3/4, as well as just making the taxing effects much better. Also, cost reduces your own stuff.
Yeah, it basically becomes a Grand Arbiter at that point.
Which is pretty scary. I mean, 3/4, I mean, kind of has Ward 1, kind of. It's pretty hard to remove.
And it's only 4 mana to flip, so, like, you can easily flip this thing on turn 4. Like, what's your opponent going to do about it, right? They can't play their 4-drops.
Yeah, definitely becomes very, very pesky. Honestly, might be good enough to main deck. Hitting all non-creature spells probably hits enough decks, so that's worthwhile. And worst case now, you can play towards the Unveil into Gareth Barton as a kind of fail-safe. The Grand Arbiter is a pretty scary effect, especially with 4 toughness instead of 3. Maybe not the easiest card to put in a deck, but I think it's pretty reasonable if you are playing it in any respect. Definitely in the sideboard, I think it's pretty excellent. Tau sees a lot of sideboard play, and this is Tau, but less conditional, and doesn't care if your opponent is playing like Tabby or something.
Yeah, and also has way better late game.
Moving on, we have Reckless Experiment, which is 3 mana Impulse Draw 3 that also comes with a flip side from the graveyard.
So, looking at Professor Haldean's text, it looks like it can easily go infinite.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree, since it's like Moonlit Hunter, except also pings your opponent every time it happens.
Yeah.
It also doesn't even need to be non-creature spells, just every spell.
Of course, the problem is like actually getting this thing into play because unlike Moonlit Hunter, it's not a creature on the front side, so it can't be creature tutored.
Yeah, though admittedly, I think you can just play a normal deck. Reckless Experiment is a pretty reasonable card. 3 mana, draw 3. Doesn't draw lands, unfortunately.
Have 3 mana impulse draw effects been playable?
No, but I think the fact that it's also a win condition is pretty powerful. I mean, neither side is like playable by itself, but I think the combination makes it seem pretty good. Also, if you play like discard effects, this is a pretty reasonable thing to discard. So like if you want to be playing like creative salvage, this is a pretty nice thing to discard. Granted, you'd be playing creative salvage just as kind of a pseudo mill effect almost. But having just another win condition in blue-red, or one of the two, whilst it's hybrid, you can probably pick up the other color by turn 5 anyways. It's pretty nice since the win conditions blue-red aren't that great. I mean, Zero Out, Box You, and Malong aren't going to win you the game by themselves super easily.
You play this in Box You?
I don't see why not.
Yeah, like it actually gives you a win condition for Box You when you go off and cast a bunch of spells.
Yeah, it also gives you another value engine if you play along Box You and Malong, so you're not relying on Box You and Malong. Helps fairly graveyard for Zero Out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems pretty reasonable. Then we have Spiritual Guidance.
So, reminds me of Enlightenment.
Yeah, very similar to Enlightenment, since even though Enlightenment is mono-white, it's basically a blue-white card because most decks were playing along Terraformer's Globe, since Enlightenment plus Terraformer's Globe draws 2 cards in the turn cycle.
Yeah.
And this also, well, it doesn't draw 2 cards in turn cycle, since it doesn't like untap Terraform's Globe, even if it does replace draw. It does work with more things than Enlightenment.
Right.
So
it works with lands. You can just fetch and draw a card off that.
Yeah, fetches are really good with it. Also, if you just play like cheap non-mana abilities on lands. So we mentioned Dragonwall Gates as earlier for 1/1's bones, and well, that works here as well. Just straight up a free non-mana activated ability. So you play it with whatever random creatures you have. Cane Dancer's obviously a pretty decent pick. Tap it, activate Dragonwall Gate, draw a card, gain a life. The life seems pretty important here. End of your opponent's turn, do the same. If you really need to, you can activate its own activate ability, which isn't great, but phases an attacker. You don't want an infectious ego to attack. Activate the ability, draw a card, gain a life.
I guess the main problem is that you're playing a 3-mana enchantment.
Yeah, it is kind of on the edge in that case. It's a bit harder to enable than Enlightenment. Maybe a bit weaker than Enlightenment in general, because Enlightenment does do some pretty nasty things. In general, Spiritual Guidance is much easier to put in your deck, which is pretty nice. And 3 mana is definitely like on the edge of being too expensive and being like cheap enough. Since there's a lot of like 4 mana cards that you really can't tap out for if they're not doing anything, but they do win the game. And 3 mana you can kind of tap out for them reasonably. as long as they do a bunch of stuff. It's like the villainy cycle of cards being a prime example of that. I think it's overall pretty neat and definitely pretty reasonable to use. Even just off the top of my head, there's also Kaelin as a card that works pretty well with this.
Right.
Non-mana activated ability that's cost 0. So it doesn't really take much effort to actually make use of this. And again, the life gain is pretty nice when you're trying to do these slow kind of things. But moving on, we have Alchemist Abode.
So, I mean, it's a free sack outlet for any permanent.
Yep, 3 sack outlet. So if you want a sack outlet, works. Only does it once, since sacks itself.
Also makes you lose a land.
But really just anything, any lands that get you free value late game are pretty nice. There's another kind of version of this in the format, but I believe it costs an additional 1 to sack. And doesn't have utility with being a sack outlet if you want one. So yeah.
Yeah.
And then finally we have
The Mistake.
/ Animus Life's Mystery.
One ominous name, The Mistake.
It's a Phyrexian Revoker. 1/2 is a bit worse of a stat line than 2/1, but I'll take a Phyrexian Revoker.
Also not an artifact, so it doesn't get wrecked by Anointed Cursebreaker.
Yeah, very nice. That made the comparison isn't too important because Revoker obviously isn't in the format. So this kind of effect is obviously good. Being a creature, I think, is in general better than what we have access to, like Sorcerer's Spyglass, since you suit up with equipment and whatnot. Additionally, much like Barton, you have Unveil, and Animus Life's Mystery is pretty scary.
It completely locks out fetch lands.
Yeah, locks up fetch lands, locks up planeswalkers. Is a 4/4. I mean, 4/4 is a pretty darn good body.
You lock your opponent out and start bashing them.
Definitely depends on the deck you're playing against, whether this is great or not. But there's a good amount of planeswalkers lying around. 4/4 is, as always, pretty hard to kill. Most decks don't just randomly have a way to deal with a 4/4. Or even better, a lot of decks can only really deal with it through planeswalkers, which is kind of funny. But I think overall this is a pretty solid sideboard card.
I don't want to run too many copies of it because it's legendary. So unlike Revoker, where you can just play on extra Revokers and try to screw your opponent even further, this thing you actually have to choose what to name.
Yeah, doesn't stack it as well. Though you do have the upside of the fact that it doesn't really need to stack if you unveil it.
Yeah.
It's pretty nice. Also, if you actually want to be pretty cheeky about it, you can play it with Monument of the Fallen Man or like Beck in the Pack. Well, I guess Beck in the Pack isn't the best way to put it in play because copy isn't useful. But if you can cheat in like that, you can name a fetch land and they can't do anything about it.
Right.
But yeah, and I think that's the end of our review of Fenav.
I like the aesthetics of the set a lot. And I mean, the whole set is just built around the story. There's like 24 story spotlight cards. So actually, I do like how tight this set is designed because there's very little mechanics. Like there's only 3 mechanics, and I don't feel like there's any extraneous mechanics in the set. All the themes are really focused.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't feel like it's trying to like appeal to anything mechanically, at the very least. Where like there's very, very few cards that feel like it's like, oh yeah, this card is meant to go in this deck. It's more so just like, oh yeah, this is a card. That's cool. So it's in the set. And a lot of the synergies are just kind of like based off these very broad synergies, like, oh, enchantments, like the packs, having the enchantment type line, that's important. Or hey, vials as a sack outlet, that's important.
Yeah, and then,
but it's not really being like wink wink, you should do this. Agonize is just a very nice mechanic in general, in my opinion, because it kind of fits the nice thing of, oh well, need to play creatures, need to play non-creatures. Make sure you're playing at least somewhat on a fair access.
Yeah, like a Warm 1 Bones is a really good example of that, because something that would have been broken, it's actually balanced at 3 mana just because Agonize requires you to keep pinging down your own creatures to use stuff.
But even for like more like basic stuff, like clean sweep, you kind of have to be like, okay, well, I do always want a creature to agonize this onto, which makes it kind of interesting in a deck building way.
Yeah. I didn't realize that Persist was in a set. I think we only covered one card without a mechanic.
Oh yeah, I guess it's maybe worth mentioning that there's probably some more Persist combos that you can do if you want. Though I don't think any of the Persist creatures are cheap, and some of them, like Malicious Surgeon, are just worse versions of Persist cards already in format. Not for worse, because Persist is a bit of a annoying mechanic in both Constructed and Limited, but
yeah,
I'm a pretty big fan of the set.
Also, like, have you looked at the story of this set?
Nope. Oh well, kind of. I'm vaguely aware.
You read the flavor text, I guess.
No.
Wait, no? You haven't even read the flavor text yet?
I'm vaguely aware of what story is being told.
Yeah, social commentary in our MSCM set.
From what I'm aware of, it seems interesting, though I haven't gone out of my way to look into it. My understanding is that it plays on a lot of Frankenstein-esque themes, but in a very different way.
Yeah, and then Unveil is also in the set. I like Unveil because like when I first saw it, I thought it was just a boring mechanic because it's literally just like transform this thing as an activated ability. Like we already seen mechanics that do that before, but it managed to like fit into the flavor of the set really well. So even though it's a boring mechanic, it works out really well in the end.
And from a mechanical point of view, I've always liked those kind of mechanics. I mean, Chosen One is another mechanic that's basically the same in MSCM, with only difference is it requires Wooburg.
Yeah.
But I always found that those played out very well, since you do have a lot of very nice patterns with how they play out, where you have like a cheap body that doesn't really do a ton, and then eventually it's going to be a threat later on. Your opponent has to deal with it at some point, and they'd prefer to deal with it before you unveil it or Chosen One it, since it's more annoying to deal with afterwards. But actually unveiling it or Chosen One-ing costs a lot, so finding a good place to do it is going to be hard. So there's a lot of kind of tension there.
Yeah.
Both from your point of view and your opponent's.
But otherwise, I think we already talked long enough about this set. So final thoughts, this is a really well-designed set.
I think mechanically this is a pretty solid set. Nothing really stands out to me as being remotely problematic, or a lot of stuff seems really entertaining, at least for me, to play around with. Isn't kind of like wink wink, you should put this in this deck at any point. So it's kind of more open.
Yeah. Anyways, so this is the set review. We're signing out, I guess. Expect the Kirinix Expedition set review coming soon too.